All right. Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, Transform Performance Testing with the Latest Advancements in AI, sponsored by BlazeMeter by Perforce and featuring Keith Puzey. Before our presentation begins, let me explain the console. The panel on the right has a feature to chat, ask questions, and answer today's poll and some handouts for you. We have the FAQ in there, and then we will share the session slide at the end. If you minimize this panel, just click on the chat button to reopen it. Should you experience any technical issues, please send me, Sarah Crocker, a private chat, and I'll be happy to help you. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but feel free to enter in your questions at any time throughout the presentation. To optimize the bandwidth for your best viewing experience, please close any other applications you may have running in the background. This event is being recorded and will be made available to watch on demand. Once the recording's ready, you'll get an email with access to the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Keith.
Thank you. So, thank you for joining today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name's Keith Puzey. I'm part of the BlazeMeter team. And what we're going to talk about today is how you can use AI with your performance testing. So if we look at the agenda, to start with, what we want to just spend a few minutes just going through, what's the importance of test data? Also an overview of test data. So what is it? How do you generate test data today? And we're going to do a poll just to get some feedback as to how you're generating test data today to help us understand as we move into the AI piece, how AI can help you. We're going to look at how we can actually leverage AI for your test data. And we'll move on then to look at how we're actually using AI within BlazeMeter when you're actually generating test data. Now, time permitting, we might even go into a demonstration to show you it live. But then we're going to end with some conclusions. And what they're going to include is things like some best practices. So things you should consider, not just with BlazeMeter Test Data AI, but other AI tools. And then we'll have a Q&A. So as we said, as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A section. And at the end, we'll answer all your questions for you. So let's get started. So the first thing is, as you look at this slide, some of these points should resonate with you if you're using test data for your performance testing. These are typical issues that we see when we talk to our customers. Now, things like we're running testing and we end up getting errors and defects in production because we don't have enough test data to cover the range of test cases we have. Quite often we have issues where there's just not enough test data. We want to run some kind of large scale test. And for that, we need a large amount of test data. How can we actually have that data available to us to run these kind of large scale tests? And also, we get tests that fail a lot because the data is either invalid, it's out of date, it's just wrong for the test. And there's an effort to maintain that. And we're going to talk about that as well. And as it says here, sometimes your load test just fails because at the end of the day, you get to a certain point and there's just not enough data to actually run that performance test. So we're going to walk through how today we address these challenges and how with the AI piece, we can make it easier, quicker, and simpler to actually generate that test data. So let's start with what's the important, why do you need test data? And obviously, you need it to drive your tests. So that this test data could be as simple as parameters in your test, variables. It could be data you need to generate users, to generate inventory. So the data can be any manner of data requirements depending on your application. And it is key to the test. Without the test data, obviously, you can't test something that simulates a real world interaction with the application. Now, you could just generate strings of data that don't really look like real data, but you're not really testing how the application would be tested when you've got real users, real data, and also real issues. Now, when you have users using the application, they don't always do what you expect. And the test data obviously can consist of things like real production data. It could be synthetic. It could be something you're mocking. And we're going to show examples of this as we go through the presentation, talk about the pitfalls and how AI can help. Now, what's key when we're talking about test data is quality. And you'll hear this a lot when people talk about their test data. It's not just the quantity of the data, it's the quality. To be able to test a broad range of use cases, you need a quality test data for that to be effective. If you have poor quality data, that leads to poor quality testing, and poor quality testing leads to missing defects, missing issues, and possibly releasing updates that contain issues. And obviously, by doing that, that then affects your end user, and that affects the quality of your product. Now, if you were to just use production data, that also is kind of the opposite in that there's other risks that go with that, and that is the risk of that data leaking and that data getting out in the wild and an issue for your compliance teams. And we're going to talk about the different ways we can actually generate these data. Now, the mixture of using your real data, using synthetic data, what's the best approach when it comes to building out a good model for your test data? And that may be a mixture of all the different things we're going to talk about, and how the AI component can actually leverage that, be that to improve the speed of actually generating the data or the quality. So let's get started. So these are what we believe are, when you're talking to anyone that needs to generate test data, these are the general challenges you're going to have. And the biggest one is, if you use production data, it's the compliance, it's the privacy issues, it's the security issues of using data that basically contains no live data. Now, sometimes you need to possibly use some data that's live. If you want to do anything that's obviously in production, there's some degree of using live data. And we're going to talk about that shortly. But that's the first big issue is, now, what data do you need? Can I use live data? Can I modify that data in some way? Or do I need to create new data? Quite often when you talk to development teams, what they'll do is they will generate their own data. And this is quite common when you talk to developers. They will have a set of data that they use for their tests. Now, the issue with that is you're using the same data time and time again to run your tests. You have no variety, and it's kind of happy path testing that you're testing with the same thing every time. That works. There's a degree of complacency then gets into the testing because it always works. The tests never fail. Things are great. How do you actually start testing your application more widely with more data? And we'll go through that. And this leads into, certainly with performance testing and load testing, it's the volume of data. So one is there's the quality, but the main thing is the variety and the quantity. How do you have high quality data in the quantity you need to actually run a large scale load test? And then how do you actually then keep that data consistent? We talk about data consistency, and that actually is not just the consistency as in the data consistency. So perhaps you have a column that's a first name, a column that's a last name, and what you actually want is an email address that looks the same. So you want to take that first name, that last name, combine them to make an email address. So when you look at the data, it looks real. So that's one thing we talk about in consistency. The other is, how do you keep it consistent across your application? Now, quite often what you're testing is not a simple application. There'll be multiple endpoints. There'll be the primary application, which probably has databases. There will then be secondary systems, authentication systems, third-party systems. How can you generate this data and make sure it's consistent across the whole stack that you need to be working and consistent to run your tests? And then how do you actually make this simulate this kind of real-world complex data in your test data, when you actually run your tests? So let's go and look at how we can do this. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the different types of data generation. So this is kind of building on, we have these issues that we need to address when we're creating test data. These are the different methods that generally you will use to generate test data. So the first one is obviously production data. So you can take the data from your live systems. It obviously represents the actual data, so it's the best data you can use because it is the data that is actually in your application and represents your existing application database. The huge issue with this, and it always has been, is the privacy and security concerns around managing that kind of data, ensuring that it's protected. You obviously would never let it leave your environment for third parties to use. And the main issue when we talk about using your production data is the actual is the edge cases. So you can only test with what you've got. So if you're designing a new application and that application contains new perhaps a new region, a new product, that data does not exist in your test data. So how can we actually address that when we actually generate our test data? Because see, within your application database, the data just does not exist. So that kind of leads into the second column where we talk about test data management tools. So TDM tools have been around for a very long time, and they let you manage the generation of test data predominantly from production. So taking that production data, masking it, anomalizing it, and making it data that can be used within the organization without the risk of that data leaking. Now, these kind of TDM tools, they allow you to do things like versioning and rollback. They're very powerful in what they do. Some of the cons with these kind of TDM tools are obviously the implementation cost of actually deploying this type of tool. Obviously, the training. So obviously, you need to be able to train people to use this third-party tool, and the diversity of the data. You still need to be able to actually create a diverse range of data because you're still starting with your production data. You've still got the limitation of you've only got certain types of data. And that kind of leads into the third column. And that's when we talk about synthetic data. So how can you generate the data you need based on rules? So you don't ever look at real data. You never take any of that real production data. What you do is create a series of rules that generate the data to look like production data. It gets around the compliance issues because basically you are not using production data. It allows you to generate data for different scenarios because literally you can say you want to add data for a new region, a new product. No, you just change the rules and you generate the data. And it's fully scalable because you can generate data, 1 row, 10 rows, 1 million rows based on the rule. The only cons with when we talk about synthetic data is it's not always a perfect fit for real world data, and certain scenarios synthetic data doesn't really work, and we'll talk about that later. And obviously there's a bit like with the test data management tools, there's a setup and a training to actually get you to that point where you have a data model. So you understand the data structure you have, but actually then converting that into the rules and the data model, there's a learning curve there. And we'll talk about that shortly as well. And finally, there's the data orchestration, which is combining this together because quite often not one of these is an answer to your problem. Most of our customers will be using a combination of augmented data with synthetic data, and the test data orchestration allows you to do how to take that data and to come up with the final test data you need. And we'll talk about that as we get further in the presentation about how data orchestration works. Now, before we move on, we want to do a poll. So there's a poll. If you go to the poll, what I'd like you to do is to give us a feedback on what we've just talked about, these different types of data generation. What do you actually use in your environment today? How do you generate test data? So if you can go to the poll and just select an option that basically matches your current test data, how you actually do it. So we've got a few polls being completed, so that's great. Thanks very much. We'll just wait a minute or so to give everyone a chance to do the poll. So at the moment it looks like a mixture, as I said. It's quite normal to have a mixture of these different types of use cases. So there's not one technology that kind of fits everything. So that's good. We're getting some good feedback, so thank you for that. We'll give it just another minute before we move on. Right, so we've got up to a good number of responses, so I think that's very good. I think you can carry on doing the poll as we carry on. But from the poll, what I can see is almost half of you have said it's a mixture of the different types of technology. And there's still quite a large percentage that do manual data entry. And that's interesting because obviously um, manual creation of data, as we're going to talk about shortly, is a burden on your teams, and also you don't get the quality of the data. So we've talked about these different ways we can generate test data. What we're going to talk about now is kind of some of the techniques that you use. So obviously we've talked about it a few times. Now, when you're using production data, is how do you obfuscate the data? Now, you need to use your production data for whatever reason. So how do you make it in a way that you can use it, but there's no leakage of that sensitive data? And obviously, this is very important for things like compliance, for GDPR. And that's where we talk about doing the obfuscation. So the masking, the encryption. So taking the data and perhaps reformatting it in a way so that it doesn't look like the real data and it's valid for your test case. And no, we're talking about load testing here. No, things like JMeter, the primary way that we load data into a tool like JMeter for our testing is via CSV files. So we need to get this data, be it coming from our synthetic data generation, from our production mask data, into CSV files that we can then use and consume as part of our test. And we show you how we can do that with BlazeMeter. We're also going to talk about seed lists, and seed lists are something you can consider as being they're part of our platform, and they're part of most synthetic data generation platforms. And a seed list is a list of data that contains real world data. So like I said, no, you can just generate data based on rules that say you want a particular string length that contains a certain amount of characters, alphanumeric exactly. But a seed list gives you a list of real data. So typical examples of seed lists are first names, last names, cities, product names. A seed list can be anything. And this allows you to say, when you're actually generating your data, now I need a certain number of first names. And if you were then to combine them with a different seed list of last names, you actually then get different combinations of those first and last names. And that leads into the synthetic data generation. So this is where we talk about how can you generate data of the volume that you need with the quality you need for your testing. And with synthetic data generation, what the basis of this is what we call a data entity. So a data entity is the definition of what does the data look like. So what we mean by that is, we know that for our test, we need 10 parameters. We understand what those parameters look like. Now, if it's a date, we understand the format of the date. We perhaps understand the range of those dates. If it's a name, we understand, it's first name and last name. If it's something like a location, we understand the locations we need. Within the data entity, for each of those parameters, we need to create kind of a rule that says, what does that data look like? Now, when we create the rule, we then just say, this is the rule for that data parameter. And when we execute the data generation, we then say, these are the rules for all the parameters we need. And we need 100 rows. And the generation tool will then generate me 100 rows based on those rules. And we'll show you that in just a second. So this is very much what's happening today and has been for years. So what's different when we start talking about AI? So the first thing we need to talk about is generative AI. Obviously, AI has been in the news. It's been around realistically, very publicly for about the last year or so. And you hear a lot about it in the trade press about generative AI. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about what is it. So things like OpenAI, they're generative pre-trained transformers. And what they can do is generate something that looks realistically like you're talking to a human. So you see this a lot with things like chatbots. Um, if you ever go to ChatGPT and you just type in your question, your prompt, you ask a question, and unlike a search engine, what you'll get back is instead of like a list of endpoints, URLs to go to, you'll get an answer to your question. So it'll format a response that could be a paragraph, it could be a page that answers the question that your prompt says. And that's the point of this kind of tool. No, it's taking human readable text and converting it into something that makes sense to answer your question. Now, obviously, you can also use with this kind of tool, you can do things like, no, here's a bit of code. No, why does this code not work? There's lots of ways that generative AI can be used to improve the way that you work. And now, as we've talked about the AI over the last year or so, now you see it popping up in lots of different areas. Obviously, it's been used to generate pictures. It's been used to actually answer questions. Um, but also, there's also concerns been raised. And we're going to talk again, we're going to talk about it here, but also later in the presentation. There's ethical concerns. There's concerns with regulatory concerns. A lot of the organizations I work with, when you talk to them about AI, invariably there's some kind of discussion going on as to how the organization is going to use AI currently, what the plans are for the future, and what the kind of questions they will ask you when you're actually talking about using AI. And we're going to talk about some of the best practices around, what should you consider before you start using AI kind of technology. And we'll talk about specifically how that works with BlazeMeter. So AI, when you're talking about test data, it kind of fits into three camps. Now, if you're using a test data management tool with AI, it's generally going to be used for things like improving the quality of that test data management tool. So improving the way that you normalize the data, improving the quality of the data, and sticking to your regulations. Now, data privacy regulations, things like GDPR in Europe and HIPAA. Now, how do you maintain that your data is truly compliant and there's no risk of any data being leaked? When we talk about the data synthesis, AI is very powerful and it can help you generate data that looks like real production data. So obviously, underlying this, we rely on the data that the model's been trained on to give us data that looks realistic. And we actually have spoken to some customers who are concerned that the data is sometimes may look too realistic. And they need to make sure that they can understand that there's no leakage from other tools into the model that they're using. And we'll talk about that as well shortly. And the third bucket here, we talk about data augmentation. And that is creating variations. So certain data. Now you have certain values already. And what you want is variations of that data. So AI is very good at saying, no, you have values A and B. Well, we'll show you, here's another 10 values that kind of are similar to that particular value. So let's talk about how we're leveraging AI within BlazeMeter. Now, in BlazeMeter, we use AI for several different approaches. And the first one is around data profiling. Now, what we mean by data profiling is you've already got existing data. So that data quite possibly is in a CSV file. And you're already using that data for your test. Now, to get from this data in a CSV file to a data entity that you can use to generate data, before AI, there was a learning curve. You had to look at each parameter, understand what the data is, and then map that to a corresponding function. Make sure the function generates the data you need, and then go to the next parameter. So it's just time consuming going through each parameter and learning the functions that are available and to mapping functions to data types. So what we've added to BlazeMeter into the data profiler is AI. So the profiler will start automatically. So if you've got a test that has a CSV file, or even if it has hard-coded data within the test, so you don't use a CSV file, you just got hard-coded values, the profiler will identify that. It will show you that it's found this static data. It does two things. The first thing it then does is classifies the data. So look at the data. It will then decide, what is this data? Is it a date? Is it a credit card? Is it a name? Is it a city? Whatever way it is, we use AI to identify what is the data type. And that's kind of the first part of the profile. Once we know what type of data is, now that classification is completed, the second part is, how do I actually synthetically generate a value that matches this data that's in this CSV file? So the second part is, we'll then give you the functions or the lists, the seed lists that are needed to generate the data. So anyone can basically upload their hard-coded test or their CSV files. The profiler will then build you a data entity that contains the rules for that data. You can then go in and adjust this. So it might be that sometimes the data in the CSV file, there's certain columns you don't want to parameterize. They need to be static. You can turn those off, and others we will generate the rule for. Now, what this does is, it gives you that, as well as the generation of the functions and the association of seed lists that exist in the product. If the seed list does not exist, it will generate you a list of values. Now, this allows you to extend BlazeMeter from what we have built into the product with our current seed lists to basically any value. So this works if you're in different geographics, so there's different languages. You want data for different locations. So a typical example is, you want street names in Paris. We don't have a seed list for street names in Paris. You ask the tool for that, and it will then generate that for you. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So this is the first part, which is the profiling. The second part is the data generation. So we're using AI to generate your data. And some of the key things here are, the first thing is that we take human readable requirements and convert that to data. So in our example, you can see we have this. The first example is street names in Amsterdam. So within the tool, that's what you type in. You type in, my requirement is I want street names in Amsterdam. And as you can see in the screenshot in the left-hand column, these are Dutch street names. Now that string could be anything. So it could be you want football teams, whatever the value is, you just put in the value, the requirement for the data, and we will then return you a list that matches that requirements. And you do not need to understand behind the scenes if that data is coming from one of our internal seed lists, or if that data is coming from we're actually creating that list externally using AI. We can also do this kind of matching values. So if you look at the second example, what I've done is I've just put in Amazon and eBay. And what I've said is that, no, I want similar values to this. So I know that, basically I want online stores. And in the right-hand preview example, you'll see the AI has returned me examples that match that value. So this is where it allows you to extend the range of data based on existing values. So you already know certain values that you want. You just need more data like that. Now, one other thing that we've done, as well as these two functions here, is there's something called the function generator, which kind of builds on this, that if you're not sure what function you need, you can click on it and it's like a little wizard pops up. You type in a string that says what your requirements are, and it will then return you either a BlazeMeter function and the syntax required to use that function, or it will return you a list value of the data you need. And the whole point of these two, the profiler and the data generation, is around getting you to the point where you can generate data quickly. Now, getting the rules in the data entity created so you can start using the product quickly. And we then build on that. If I change the slides, with something we call data distribution. And data distribution can still use these AI functions. So if you look at the example here, we've created a parameter. And in this case, we want a parameter that's going to be mobile carriers. Now, if you look at the first function here, we basically put in similar values. We want AT&T and Verizon. So we want US mobile cellular providers. The second function, we put in Vodafone, O2 and EE. These are UK mobile providers. And what we've said for this parameter, we've set this probability of 50-50. We want 50% of the values to be the first function and 50% to be the second value. So you can now, instead of just having a parameter that says I want carriers, you can start to model the distribution of the data within a parameter. And at the top of the screen, where we have this distribution mode, where we've got random, probability, and guaranteed, you can kind of be specific on how this data distribution works. So guaranteed is if you say, in this case, 50-50, if it's set to guaranteed, you will get, with 100 records, you'll get 50 of the first function and 50 of the second. Probability and random allows you to actually include some degree of randomness in the values. So you can put in, it'll be roughly 50%. Yeah, so it allows you to build a rule that lets you create this data distribution. And like I said, this is also leveraging the functions which are the AI generated. And this leads into, we talk about this chaos testing, negative testing, and this allows you to basically create a data distribution that sends negative data. So an example here is I have a parameter that's a credit card. I've come into my data distribution. In this case, I've just clicked the button that said suggest negative data. And what the tool has done is then given me a range of functions to generate different types of negative data. So the first one is saying, no, in this case, it's an Amex credit card. It's going to put a 1 in front of the Amex card to make it invalid. And then we've got others that add different strings, just random, a string of numbers, a string of alphanumeric. And the last example will give me Diners Club cards. So everything here is negative. And we then define the probability of how we're going to weight these different functions and weight the distribution of the data we're going to generate. Now, you may say, why do we need to do negative testing? And I was talking to a customer recently, and they had released an update into production. Everything was great. They'd passed all their tests. After a few weeks, they actually found there was an issue that crept in, and it was actually memory leak. And the issue was that their customers obviously are not perfect, and they typed in invalid data. Invalid names, invalid passwords, invalid addresses. There was an issue where the system couldn't cope with this bad data. Now, they'd done happy path testing with their data, always good data, and that worked. When real users started to use it and started to introduce errors, that introduced a problem into the application, which then manifested as a memory leak, and obviously it ended up being in production. And as we all know, errors in production are much more expensive to fix. So within BlazeMeter now, we have this functionality where you can mix and match your negative data and your positive data. You actually create variants within your data model. Now, for this test, we're going to test with positive data. For this test, we're going to test with negative data to allow you to be more granular when you're actually defining what test you're going to use for your testing. And that leads on to our test data orchestration. So this is where, we talked about when we did the survey that there's a mixture. Now you've got a mixture of your existing data along with random generated data and perhaps even manual data. You need to be able to combine that because every test is going to need a range of data. So within BlazeMeter, we have test data orchestrator, and obviously there are other orchestration tools. And taking this kind of tool, you can then combine this data. Now combine your CSV data, take it with your synthetic data generation, and output your high quality data that you need for your tests. And this is really important because when we talked about our data consistency, how do you keep your data consistent across the application stack that you're using? So now this is a very simple example, but no, you have a web front end, you have your application. The application probably talks to a database or several databases. There's probably several third-party services or external services that are needed. So when you actually run your test, it's not as simple as just putting the data into a particular database. You need to seed the environment with the data. So certainly when we're talking about using synthetic data, now we can generate all the data before the test starts. But how do you then take that data and get it into the application in a way that is safe and secure and repeatable, so that the tester doesn't need to worry about talking to the teams about loading data into applications, getting environments ready. They can build this automation into their testing scripts. And then, as in this example here, you can see we're pushing data into a database. Perhaps we're pushing data into a mock service that's mocking a service, and it's all using the same data entity. And the way we do this is with the orchestration tool. Now, this is built into BlazeMeter. It can be run on our public infrastructure. It can be run on premise to use your internal network if you need to. And the key thing about things like orchestration is we generate the data. So the first thing we're going to do is take your data entity, run it through the AI function generators and generate the data. We can then take that and through data orchestration, we can perhaps push that into your application server via an API. So perhaps this is loading data into your application server, or we can pull data. So I have one customer that they need to get, they have inventory data in their test data. They want to refresh it with real work, kind of up-to-date production quantities. So they use our test data orchestrator to generate data, but then also call the live system to populate the test data with quantities from the live system. We then have that data for our test, which we consume as part of the test. And one of the key things about things like orchestration that you can use it for are typical examples are creation of accounts. You want to create some new users. Without this kind of tool, you'd probably have to go to the application team to create those users and then send you the data, and that quite possibly will take a long period of time. Now, I've heard of that taking weeks with certain organizations. We can automate that. So we generate the data. We use the TDO to actually then inject that data into your application for you to consume it. And at the end of the test, what we can then do is clean up that data. So remove that data that we've generated to refresh the environment back to the start. We typically see this when we want to test user registration. So we'll generate all the users through our synthetic data generation. We will then inject those users through the registration system, run our tests, and at the end we can then remove those. Now all of this relies on the fact that the application has APIs that we have access to and that have the relevant functions we need to do what we need to do. But the test data orchestrator is there to orchestrate this kind of thing. So what I'd like to go into now is kind of some of the conclusions and kind of best practices when we talk about using AI with test data. So obviously we've talked about it several times, but the way that we've incorporated AI into our tool is around time saving. So that time saving is several things. One is the time saving we're actually building the data entities. So using things like the profiler and the data function generator to quickly get you from the point where you have static data to where you have rules you can use to generate data. So that's the first thing, is time saving. And it kind of leads into the second point here, which is around cost reduction, reducing manual labor. It's about efficiency, improving the efficiency of how you generate the data, as well as the quality of that data. And that leads into, we talk about the quality, having a diverse range of scenarios. So being able to create those edge cases that you haven't got in your production database. Also, with our test data orchestrator, that keeping the data consistent, allowing you to build a data entity that's consistent and then use that in your environment during the test, and doing this on demand. And when we talk about on demand, when the test starts, we will generate the data. So if you use our tool, you'll see a preview screen that shows you what the data looks like. That's a preview. That's not the data you'd actually use when you run the test. When the test runs, we will generate new data. That allows you to have a truly dynamic set of test data using every time you run a test. Now, some of the other conclusions we want to talk about is obviously around the AI. Some of the things you need to consider with AI. And obviously, something that quite often comes up is around data privacy and security. So if you're calling an AI tool, where's that data going? What's it been used for? Is it being used to train a model? And these are questions that you need to ask any company that's actually supplying, offering an AI type tool. Now with BlazeMeter, with the profiler, we are sending that data to the AI tool to actually classify the data. We actually have an option if you don't want to use that, you can override it and turn it off if you're not happy with that data being sent to the AI tool. With the other functions, so things like the function generator and the data generator, that data does not leave our platform. So those are within the BlazeMeter environment. So in that case, we're using AI, but we're using AI within our platform and no data leaves. Things you need to consider when you're actually looking at the AI data that comes back are things like bias. Now, if you ever looked at any AI training, the way the data model is trained, sometimes you can introduce bias. Depends where the data comes from, but you need to validate the data. You can't just blindly assume that the AI is giving you the data you need. You need to actually start using it, validate the responses you get back, and look for things like bias that might be causing the data to be skewed in one way or the other. And also something that if you talk about ChatGPT, there's something called hallucinations that AI tools can generate. And that's something that's getting better. But if you ever use ChatGPT, sometimes you'll get an answer that is wrong. And the model based it knows point A and point C and doesn't know point B. And it basically makes up something. So you need to be mindful of, AI is not perfect. You need to be looking at the data and actually do evaluations to make sure that the data being generated is correct and you're not getting these kind of biased or false information coming back from the tool. You also need to look at there is some companies that have concern about lack of control. If data is leaving your network, that's going out of your control, and we get questions about is it being used to be trained? Could other their competitors basically get access to that data? And these are all questions that you need to be considering when you look at using AI tools. So we talked about the verification, and finally, before we go into Q&A, what I would say is it's about building your best practices. So when you're looking at using an AI type tool with your test data, you need to look at your designing a best practice, defining your rules within the organization as to are you allowed to do this? Is it okay with your governance teams? Are there any risks? And if there are risks, are those risks something that you can mitigate? So with that, I think we can go to the Q&A. I think we have some questions.
We do have some questions. All right. Our first question from Alex is BlazeMeter making an API call to OpenAI to take advantage of generative AI capabilities, or did Perforce build their own LLM?
So great question. We're actually using the Microsoft service, and behind that is ChatGPT. So we're not using our own model. We're using the Microsoft service. I forget what the name of it is, but basically it's a service offered from Microsoft that is using ChatGPT.
All right. Our next question is from JP. How how does the data link from table to table? Primary keys or foreign keys?
So when we looked at the examples that we're using, we don't actually inject data into a database, and that's one of the issues when you talk about test data management products, is managing those keys and keeping the data consistent. Well, what BlazeMeter does is we use the API. So basically, it's up to the API to deal with moving the data in and out of the database. So we have no concept of keys, public keys, private keys within the actual database, because we're relying on the application layer when we actually do our publishing.
Okay. Our next question is, in BlazeMeter, are you using Chat GPT API or you have your own machine learning process?
I think we just did that question.
Yeah, I was like, that looks a little familiar. Um, because AI can make mistakes via hallucinations, data drift, etc., does BlazeMeter provide solutions to help verify the data is correct, or do we need to verify all data manually?
And that's a great question. We do to a degree. So within the tool, we are checking as far as we can to make sure that the data we're getting back is valid and is not an hallucination. But when we're looking at things like generating lists of values, it's very difficult to identify if it's an hallucination. With our functions, so when you're actually in the function generator and we're using the tool to actually build our data entities, um, we do identify where a function is invalid, and we hide it, so you won't see it, and we actually do a retry to get another answer. So I would say you'd still need to validate data. Certainly, when you first start using tools like this, you should be validating data, creating some examples, creating a few hundred rows of data, and visually scanning the data to make sure it looks okay. So I wouldn't say there'll be no hallucinations, but what I would say is we do actually have processes in place in what we use to weed out any hallucinations that may actually be produced by the AI.
Great. I love it. They call them hallucinations. I think that's so funny. Randy is asking, when AI does the categorization of the data, I'm assuming there will need to be some amount of machine learning model training first, and then it will not be 100% accurate and learn over time, correct?
Yeah, so at the moment, we're using the Microsoft model. So obviously we're relying on their model. We have a separate instance of the model. It's our model, but it's based on the ChatGPT one. And you're right. At the moment, the testing that I've done, the model has returned data correctly for everything I've tried to do. But obviously the great benefit of things like AI is that these models can be retrained. And retrained, they get better, they get more clever, and they actually give better responses. But today, yes, the model is basically built, and it is kind of a static model at the moment, but it will get retrained.
Okay. Albert is asking, is the auto general data suitable for all application or centered on a specific application?
Um, Generally, I'd say it's for all. There's obviously there's always use cases where you can't use synthetic data or no automatically generated data. And certainly when you look at your application servers, there will be times when you need to use static data for various reasons. Perhaps it's when it's talking about things like IDs in applications, um, there's no point in generating random strings if you need to use values that already exist. And that's where we look at using our test data orchestrator to extract data from your application server, where there's values that basically need to be kind of hard coded that come from the application. Um, the majority of the time, I would say synthetic data can be used for most testing. Um, but that's why when we talked about earlier about the different ways that you generate data, there's not one tool that fixes everything. There's generally going to be a mixture of taking data from your existing systems, generating new ones, or combining those together.
Right. Our next question is from Juan Pablo. Is there a maximum number of calls or tests using AI data?
No, and that's a very good question. I didn't really cover that. So when we actually generate the data, this is done before the test starts. So the way that BlazeMeter uses test data is before your test. Now, if you click on the start button, um, the first thing we do is generate data. So at that point, we're making all the calls to the AI system. We're doing all the internal data generation, and basically we're then calling our orchestration tool. And at the end of that, we end up with the CSV files that contain the data that we've generated. Um, the next step is then the test will start. So we provision the infrastructure, send out the test scripts, and run the test. So and there is no limit to that. Now, if you've got a license that allows you to generate that amount of data, then you can. There are, depending on your license within BlazeMeter, there are kind of rules. If you're on the free tier, you can generate, I think it's 10 rows of data. But the number of rows of data you can generate varies depending on your use case and your license. If you need more test data, you just talk to us. No, it's purely a way of, we need to talk to you about the licensing, about how much data you can generate under your license.
Our next question, how do I comment on testing best practices?
What was the question? Sorry.
How do I comment on testing best practices? Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the question is about what are the best practices around test data,
Yeah,
which
maybe.
which we've kind of covered. And it is, we keep going back to the fact there's no one way to generate test data, depending on your application. And that's the point when you talk about building test data, you need to first understand, kind of the application and what the data looks like. And most, if it's your application, generally speaking, you will know what the data should look like. Um, and the first part of any kind of test data plan is to convert that data you've got into something you can use to generate test data. And that's around the using the things like the profiler to create entities that contain the rules. So the rules are when you're creating synthetic data, the model is the heart of that. So the model contains the kind of the rules that dictate what the data looks like. So when you talk about best practices, the best practice is to first identify the data and what it looks like and the classification of it, build the rules, and like we just said, do some validation. Then you need to go through and actually start generating multiple rows of data and start looking to see, is what you're getting back from the tool correct? Does it look like the data that you need? So there's always checks and balances when you're building these test data models.
Okay. Lisa's asking, how does BlazeMeter extract the data from the application servers? Does it access the database for that extract or use the APIs? I'm sorry.
Great. Yeah. So when we talk about the test data orchestrator, it uses the APIs, and that kind of goes to the previous question when we talked about the keys. Whenever you're trying to call a database directly, it's really difficult because what you have to understand, the schema in the database, you have to understand the structure, um, and injecting is difficult, extracting is easier. But either way, we use the API because basically, as long as you have a document API, it's very easy to include that in BlazeMeter. So when you create a data entity, we actually call it a data target in the data model. If you go into data target, you can add the rules for using the API to integrate with the application server. And Data Orchestrator allows you to string API calls together, because I've never seen an API that you can just call once to do like a data extract or data load. Invariably, you need to perhaps log in, and that login will probably give you a token of some sort, which you then need to consume on the next API call to do something else. And then you'll get to the point where you can then push data or pull data. You can build that into your test data orchestration data target to say, no, to interface with this application, these are the steps you need to go through. No, log in, get a token, consume that token, take the data we've generated it, and push it into the application server. And perhaps even after that, then do some kind of git to get back things that you may have just generated. And you can build all of that within our test data orchestrator through the APIs.
Right. Yuri's asking if there is any other AI application that you use besides generating data for non-functional tests.
In fact, yeah, that's a good question. I didn't really mention that. No, we're focused on obviously here performance testing and test data with performance testing. Everything we've talked about is available across the whole of the BlazeMeter platform. So if you're using functional testing, you can do the same thing as we just talked about. You can build a data entity. You can use the AI. You can use a data profiler if you've got existing tests in our functional testing. Everything we've talked about is available, and that's available today in the product. The same with our mock services. So if you use the mock services, the data entity model we've got, you can do the same thing. So you can have data in your mock service based on the data entity. And soon, I think by the end of the month, we're going to be releasing the test data for our API monitoring. So if you use the API monitoring within BlazeMeter, when you create an API test, you'll have the option to select a test data entity from BlazeMeter and select the variant you want. And at runtime, again, we'll generate data for API monitoring. So across the board, API monitoring, mocks, performance, and functional all can use test data, and they can all use the new AI functions.
Great. Let's see. Ryan says, you briefly mentioned starting with a well-defined process and rules. In your experiences with the orchestration integrations, what are some of the common risks you've observed being identified by organization? You mentioned things like working with governance teams, etc., but are there any common risks you can share?
The most common risk we get is we know some of the very large corporations, when you talk about AI, straight away they say you can't use AI. And that's been now there's stuff in the media about AI, and there's is I wouldn't say scaremongering, but it's the unknown today is the issue. So some of the large corporations that are very conservative basically just said no AI, and that stops the discussion because basically it's a rule. Um, um, we work with those customers to understand what the concerns are. So like I said, with our solution, only the profiler sends data outside of our environment, and we've added a feature that basically you can turn that off. So, and that's a feature that you as an account owner with a BlazeMeter account, you can turn off that feature, so no one that uses your account can use the AI profiler. So that's the first thing is we're trying to add this into the product to give you the small steps, baby steps. Now you start with the basics, and then over time, once you get more familiar with what we do and how we do it, you can basically start using AI as your organization kind of gets more comfortable with the concepts around AI.
Right. I think we have time for one more question. Juan Pablo is asking, is it capable of creating more complex data structures like JSONs on a single data column?
So today, what we generate is CSV files. So what we've talked about doing here is the data. So that test data itself creates CSV files because that tends to be what's consumed by the testing tools we use. Things like JMeter, they use CSV files. When we look at things like mock services, then yes, mock services can generate JSONs for your mocks. So if you want to use our mock services to create a mock endpoint with test data, then yes, you can generate a JSON format that contains the test data, and that data can come from AI based or non-AI based. we can also use, when we talk about the test data orchestrator, obviously because we're calling an API, quite often the payload of that is JSON as well. So again, that is AI. That is a JSON format we use when we're doing the test data orchestrator and also API monitoring.
All right, we'll reach the top of the hour. Any last words from you, Keith?
I'd just like to thank everyone for joining today. No, reach out if you have any questions. Go to blazemeter.com, and thanks for joining today.
All right. Well, this concludes our web seminar for today. Thank you to Keith for your time, and BlazeMeter by Perforce for sponsoring the web seminar. And a special thank you goes out to our audience for spending the last hour with us. Have a great day. We hope to see you at a future event.